Romans 6 and 7. Well, remember one of the questions we had coming out of the Gospels and into Acts, and we did this in our review of the Gospels before we started Acts 1, was why did Jesus die? It's not as though, it doesn't seem that Jesus answered that question directly before he died. And from what we're seeing in the New Testament authors, they don't come up with just one answer. There seems to be multiple thoughts about, again, thinking through the question, why did a Messiah, not just a suffering servant or a suffering prophet, but a suffering Messiah, also go through the process of dying? Well, Romans 6 gives us at least one answer to this question. It starts in 6, 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we who died to sin live any longer therein? And that story of dying to sin seems to have not just us in the picture, but it comes from Jesus. Well, we learn that because of 6:10. For the death that he died to sin once for all. It's not a common phrase, died to sin. It's only here and in 1 Peter 2. So, there's dying for sin and things like that, but the idea of dying to sin seems to be a pretty rare idea. So what does that mean? I think in principle, it's a very simple idea that a person who dies can't sin anymore. So they're dying from the principle of being able to sin. But we learned in 6, 1 and 2 that we died to sin as well. And again, let's watch how this story plays out. Back in 5:18, we had read, through one man's offense, judgment comes to all men, that's Adam, even though through one man's righteous act, the free gift comes to all men. So this will be considered, back in again 5:18, a righteous act. We will talk about this again more in Romans, I think, or in Hebrews, because it will be the easiest place to play out the meaning of this idea. But the faithfulness of Christ will be a doctrine or a teaching that is so vital to the bigger story of the New Testament. And then we also heard back in Acts 3 and Acts 5, and we'll hear twice more in Hebrews, the idea of Jesus being an author or a pioneer. The word in Greek is archegos, and it means, as we had said before back in Acts 3 and 5, it's a instigator. It's a person who does something like leading into battle, someone who does something not in place of someone or substituting for someone, but to do it in front of them, so as they follow through, they will reap the benefits of what the primary person does. So this is what seems to be what baptism is. We hear in chapter 6 that we died to sin in baptism. Well, what's going on there? And this is, well, think of how we today, coming out of the American evangelical tradition of D.L. Moody and then ultimately Billy Graham, where we ask someone to pray a prayer or make a decision, come down an aisle. In the ancient world, and this is far beyond just Jesus' day, but in the ancient world of Paul, and first all the way through maybe the 3rd or 4th century, the way you would show a decision is to get into a batch of water, whether it be a river or a lake or just a basin, and you would be dunked or dunk yourself, and then you come back out. Now, there's various reasons for this. I think the main point is just simple identification. They didn't sign their name to documents. They would actually do some kind of a physical act like this, and the acts change throughout the biblical story, like handing a sandal to someone in Ruth chapter 4, or putting your hand under someone's thigh and making a promise in Genesis. There's various societal ways of making a promise or a declaration, shall we say. And in the days of Jesus and Paul, we have this idea of going into water and coming out again. And that would be a very public, irreversible way of saying that you are signing up or have made a decision. Well, it's not easy to miss then in this picture of dying that we have dying going on here as well. Because when you go down into water, it's as though you die and you come back out, and of course you rise. And so you can see how in the story of baptism, I don't think they were teaching this in the days of Paul. In other words, this wasn't the only meaning of baptism. But in Romans 6, the idea is, when you think about it, Paul says, it's like dying and rising, which thus matches what Jesus did here. You don't have to actually die. You can depict the death of Christ. And so that as he rises, and we have that phrase again in chapter 6, he lives to God. The rough equivalent is, again, in chapter 6, you read, we become a slave of righteousness. And the idea of righteousness being propriety. We become a slave of that which is right on this side, much like Jesus becomes in his ascension, he lives to God. So it's just a nice picture of how the Christian life was thought of in the days of Paul. Well, this is easy to misunderstand, to misapply, the idea that I'm a slave to righteousness. So that's why I think Romans 7, Paul kind of does a turnaround, or at least a pause, and he says, I don't want to give you the impression that this is a simple idea of never doing wrong, right? Because we have in chapter 7, beginning in the last half, verse 14, let me give you a paraphrase of what I hear Paul saying. We know that the law is spiritual, working in a theoretical realm, but I am a physical. And as such, it often feels like I'm a slave to sin instead of righteousness. In fact, I don't understand why I act the way I do. I don't do what I know is right. I do the things I hate. Although I don't do what I know is right in principle, I agree that do's and don'ts are good and should be obeyed. So here's the thought. I am not the one doing these evil things. It is the sin that lives in me that does them. I know that my selfish desires won't let me do anything that's good. Even when I want to do right, I cannot. Instead of doing what I know is right, I do wrong. Now, I don't think, again, Paul is creating new theology here. He's reflecting on a story that, again, is as old as the Bible, and that is that, yes, we have this idea of what it means to be dead to sin. We can't sin anymore because we're dead, as we would say about Jesus, but oh, yes, I can. And so I think he's just ruminating on this idea of how come I know what's right. I know if I do wrong, I'm going to suffer for it. It's going to hurt people. It's going to hurt me. Going to disappoint God, and yet I do it. So I like Romans 7 for the practicality of it, and it makes us think, why did I sin the last time I sinned? It's probably due to boredom or impatience or lust or appetite or just stupidity. What we don't have in this story, and I think this is a good definition or at least a strong symptom of what it means, and we've talked about this before, or we've talked about this word loyalty so much. It's a good question. What is loyalty? How does it work? What is faith? I think he defines it well when he says, I know in principle in my mind what is right. In fact, I want to do right. If you ask me on a given day, do I want to sin? No. By the end of the day, have I sinned? Yes. So, again, what you're getting in this story here in Romans 7 is a confirmation of the biblical story that we've heard. It is not the avoidance of sin that gets you into heaven. It's not the forgiveness of sins that gets you into heaven. It's not the imputation of your sins to someone else that gets you into heaven. Conversely, it's not the doing of sin that makes you unfit for heaven. Behavior is not the issue. What is the issue is loyalty, and the way you can tell where your loyalty is by what you definitely want to do. Where is your wanter, as we would say? That would be the best way, it seems to, in a simple way, as Paul's doing here in Romans 7, to define how loyalty works.